We are very pleased and honored to have with us Donald Yerxa, Professor Emeritus of the History Department, Eastern Nazarene College, and editor of the journal Fides et Historia. Could you please, Professor Yerxa, introduce yourself?
Well, I am Donald Yerxa. I was trained as a naval historian, of all things, and that's where my doctorate, a master's and doctorate in that field. Mid-career for me, which was in the late 90s and early 2000s, I retooled, as we say, in science and religion at Oxford, Wycliffe Hall, Oxford, for 3 summers. And so that was a wonderful experience for me. And so I branched out of my narrow field of naval history and got involved in this, dare I say, dialogue or conversation about science and religion. And then rather shortly after that, I became an editor of a journal that Johns Hopkins University put out called Historically Speaking. And then I became editor of Fides et Historia. So I've done some publications early on in naval history, more recently in science and religion, but I consider myself unapologetically a generalist historian editor.
So you are one of the scholars that have been engaged in the science, religion debate or dialogue whatsoever, conversation, yes. Could you name those who have influenced your work in that direction, professors, studies, circumstances?
There have been so many. Initially, I was captured. I had a colleague at my small college, Carl Giberson, who's still writing quite a bit in this area. And he introduced me to the field of science and religion, more particularly to the John Templeton Foundation, as a rich source of patronage for these kinds of studies. And it was based on his recommendation that I applied for this postdoctoral experience at Oxford. And that was transforming. But even before that, I became acquainted with the work of Sir John Polkinghorne. And his work continues to be inspirational. He gave a Gifford Lectures that became a book by Princeton University Press, Faith of a Physicist. And he went through the basic, I think it was the Apostles, not the Nicene Creed, and from a perspective of a particle physicist / Anglican priest, showed how the basic creeds of the Christian faith are not, I'll use a negative, are not ridiculous from a scientific standpoint. They are at least credible. And that was wonderfully confirming. But more to your point, so that was my initial introduction. But there have been so many people, and people who have attended this conference, for instance. John Brooke has been a wonderful example and a source of encouragement. William Shea, whose paper I responded to here, has become a dear friend and a mentor in this area. I could go on with names, again, just people here, Ron Numbers, Peter Harrison. These are extremely influential historians. I had the privilege last evening of walking somewhere to a restaurant between 2 Gifford lecturers, John Brooke and Peter Harrison. The Gifford Lectures, I would hazard to say, are the most prestigious lectures in the world. And here's 2 of them right here, and I know them, and they've been tremendously influential. In addition to that, there have been so many conferences that I've been privileged to attend. Mainly as a speaker, I consider myself sort of on the fringes of the science and religion conversation. I'm conversant with the conversation, and occasionally I make contributions to it, but I'm not a major player. But I've been privileged to be at many events in Sicily. I helped run a little program in Venice for 3 summers called the Venice Institute for Science and Religion. There we had John Polkinghorne and a number of major scholars in this field. So I can't tell you how many books that have been influential, but to limit it to a few, it would be John Polkinghorne is sort of the one of the key figures early on in this conversation that has been inspirational.
You are, as you already mentioned, or you have been a professional historian for years. You have authored several books on the history of science or naval history, and you have been one of the leading figures in the Conference on Faith and History, a community of scholars studying the relationship between Christian faith and history. How, in your opinion, can historical expertise contribute to the science-religion dialogue?
Well, I think it's very crucial. It provides context. The notions that we play with today, the notions that we discuss, that we explore today, have a roots in earlier conversations. We just didn't arrive at this point without a great deal of discussion, debate, work that preceded it. So, as in any historical endeavor, historical inquiry provides the context for understanding the current situation. So that's a fairly obvious answer, but that would be important. Even in this conversation that we've had in the last couple of days with orthodoxy and science, you can see the importance of sort of the historical roots for some of these questions, particularly from the Orthodox tradition. How far back do we go, and what benefit do we get, which seems to be considerable, from looking at how the key figures that preceded us. So, as in any historical, I think history is utterly crucial for understanding the present world. It doesn't give you an exact template as to how to proceed. It doesn't give you the phrase lessons from the past. You have to be very careful because every situation, every circumstance is unique historically. So we never replicated the past directly. But it's an important, I'd say necessary, background information for whatever you want to do in the present and in the future.
How do you perceive the role of religion in a secularized world where the interpretation and the understanding of the human condition presupposes the dominance of science and technology?
That is an interesting question. I get religion provides the source of meaning. Science and technology are largely devoid of meaning in the sense that they unfold in their own internal dynamic. There are economic or intellectual forces that are working as science proceeds, questions that need to be investigated, applications from scientific research that can be applied in technology. Religion, at its best, enables us to step back a bit and say, what is this for? What's the purpose of it all? Where is this headed? Both as individual people and as societies. Is this a good thing to pursue? Does this make sense in terms of larger understandings of the purpose of humanity and God?
Professor Yerxa, what, in your opinion, are the implications of the current historiographical distinction between modernity and post-modernity in the science-religion dialogue?
I'm not sure I can give you a good answer for that. I think post-modernity initially, modernity is utterly crucial in understanding the historical context. It's linked almost inseparably with the scientific revolution and events that led to it and came out of it. Post-modernity has been variously described, and the term is used variously. As I understand it, initially it was sort of a scary term for me because it implied a sort of a relativistic perspective, perspective being a key word. Everything has a perspective. And, but as I look back on our postmodern moment, I'm not sure. It seems to be an extension rather than a total break from what preceded it. It seems to have been chastening of our methodological smugness. And in that regard, it's actually opened up the science and religion discussion, I think. It allows the perspective of religion to be introduced into academic discussions without much apology. Because a religious perspective is no more, I'll use a negative, invalid than any other perspective. And postmodernism is hugely perspectival. So I think it's opened up the conversation. And you could maybe go so far as to say that the science and religion conversation as it has proceeded in the last couple of decades would not have proceeded as readily had not there been a postmodern context in the academy within which to work.
Are there points of convergence between Christian eschatology and the conception of history and the sense of historical time that corresponds to modern science?
I'm not sure I can answer that intelligently. In terms of history and eschatology, those two terms, those two perspectives don't go well together. Historians are rather modest, or we should be rather modest in our attempts to say anything about the future. We deal with the past, and anything about the future is a projection. In the Christian sense of eschatology, of course, there is the doctrine and the hope of that this is moving somewhere. But for historians, that brings up the terrible notion of Whiggishness, which means a teleological approach to studies, which historians tend to ignore. Personally, however, it's hard for me not to think that history is moving, that it has a direction, and that unfolds in my personal outlook within the larger context of a divine plan, not a micromanaged plan in which God moves around people and events like a chess player, but in a larger sense toward his, if I may use gender for God, purposes. And so there's the notion that this cosmos has built in within it the mechanisms for unfolding of life, and then look at the marvelous world we live in now, the technology, just in this room that I'm sitting. All of that, to me, it's hard to see any of that, or all of that, as chance, as happenstance. Again, I'm not saying it's all fatalistically predetermined by God, but I do think that there's a marvelous freedom that's built into the cosmos to that we're able to explore some of these things because the way God created everything. As far as where's history going, I don't know. Part of me is scared about transhumanism and things like that. Where does this lead us? But as a Christian, my faith is in the Lord of history. How the Lord of history works and operates, I don't know. To bring up a topic I've broached here, it is a huge mystery. But I'm content with that mystery. Through life, we have to deal with unknowns. We have to deal with things that we can't answer. I prefer to have the questions that religion, in particular Christianity, gives me and live with those unknowns than some of the unknowns from a more secular perspective. But we all have to deal with them.
If from your point of view, those two worlds, the world of religion and the world of science, do intersect, which are the particular fields in which they cross each other? And is there any common conceptual ground, and what language do they tend to use in approach in the human.
It's an excellent question. And it's one that's been a subtext of this particular conference. I think you heard some people here at the conference heard some remarks, I think Ron Numbers in particular made them publicly, challenging this whole notion of science and religion as a conversation. In my remarks, I'm beginning to be a little uneasy about the asymmetry, meaning that religion tends not to contribute much to science. In terms of a laboratory scientist, I think at the greatest level of intersection would be ethics, ethics of funding, ethics of research, and ethics of application. There it seems to be obvious that religion could help. But in terms of what does a science do day in and day out, and I'm not a scientist, but from what I understand, religion doesn't speak to the day-to-day scientist. What this conversation, this being science and religion, does contribute, however, is to those who speak for scientists, some of them being scientists, others being public intellectuals, that kind of go beyond what science, in its capacity of science, reveals to us, and interpret science to us, and they therefore go beyond what I think is justifiable. In that sense, what this religion and science conversation does is offer a very important counter to those who would suggest that religion is always negative. It's a constraining force on our freedom to inquire. And that challenge, I think the science and religion conversation has made effectively, that there is no inherent conflict between science and religion. So I think that's, in terms of, the more I think about it, for what it's worth, I tend to think that at its best, in most of the conversations I've been involved in, science and religion, we're borrowing from each other analogies. Again, not science, but science writers or interpreters of science. We're looking at convergences, we're looking at parallels. We are looking for patterns, but whether we speak the same common language is perhaps debatable.
What benefits could possibly the familiarization with the modern science discourse attribute to a contemporary Christian way of thinking and acting, according to your...
Contemporary science and religion discourse?
Yes.
I'll put it perhaps crudely, but I think for pardon me, I think for many there's a tendency to compartmentalize our thinking. And so we have our religious thinking, and depending on your tradition, your certain doctrines, certain practices that come with that. And then we have our intellectualizing. And the science and religion dialogue has enabled many of us to bring those, if not into total congruence, recognize that my religious beliefs have some parallels in some of these scientific notions. Again, I refer to John Polkinghorne's Faith of a Physicist. It was wonderfully confirming. So I think that is important to keep in mind.
Do you believe that Eastern Christianity could also play a culturally innovative role? I skipped one, huh?
Ah.
Okay. Let's
you want to
go back?
Go back? Fine.
Yes, so to keep going with the same. Recently you edited a volume on religion and innovation.
Yes.
In what sense could religion, usually assumed to defend given traditions, be innovative, contribute to significant changes in present conditions?
I'm not sure I understood that question. What, you want me to speak to religion and innovation, but in what way?
In what sense religion, usually assumed to defend given traditions, the religion, could be innovative and contribute significant changes in this present
Well, my work in innovation and religion, and it was primarily in two different areas. It was in pre-societal New World pre-societal religions, so in Aztec and ancient Colombian American civilizations, and then in Christianity. And my work there was primarily addressed to combat a negative, much like the science and religion and conflict issue. And that is the tendency is to see religion as being antithetical to innovation. Religion represents tradition, the opposite of innovation. It stands for something that is fixed, and that it constrains innovation. And so what the work that I was essentially the head of a program, and so we divvied out funds to a variety of individual researchers, demonstrated that although religion is not always innovative, in fact, it can be constraining, it is certainly not always constraining. And there are many key instances where, if for specifics, the early church fathers spoke to religious toleration largely out of initial context of persecution that later became expanded into more, in the Western tradition, notions of religious liberty, had their origins in some of the patristic thinking. Peter Harrison has done some work in that program that I ran on notions of naturalism that have their origins in actually sort of counterintuitive, that naturalism has its origins in some of the Western Christian tradition. So I think it's demonstrably clear that religion is not always constraining, and it can be innovative as well. Not always, but it can be. The more I think about it, however, tradition and innovation are just two sides of the same coin. There's no innovation. Innovation without tradition is scary. I mean, it's incoherent. And tradition itself is it's not static. I'm talking in general terms, and perhaps Eastern Orthodoxy may challenge that notion. But the tradition is not static. Today's tradition once was an innovation at one time. And so, and we invent tradition sometimes. The Scottish kilt, for instance, was sort of an invention later on for nationalistic purposes in the Highlands. So it's a complex issue, but it's really fascinating for me. I'm not sure I addressed your question, but that's what initially comes to mind.
Now comes a question about Eastern Christianity. Do you believe that Eastern Christianity could also play a culturally innovative role?
I should hope so. I am not expert in Eastern Orthodoxy. However, from my limited understanding, and I would focus on mystery and some of those elements that Orthodoxy seems to cultivate in at least some of its work, some of its settings, some of its context, as being enormously potentially influential. It's been a shame that Orthodoxy has been largely absent from what I consider the larger I don't mean to be insulting, but the larger conversation with Latin Christianity and Protestantism. There's been very little mention of Orthodoxy. So it's wonderfully, even in the sense of a more complete picture of how science and religion have interacted, the Orthodox component has been largely missing, and it's important to include it. I suspect, not knowing how this will unfold, it seems to be relatively early in its exploration, that notions like mystery could be hugely influential in contributing to the larger dialogue.
Since you referred to the notion of mystery, can you tell us more about how this notion could be articulated in conceptual terms that science and religion might share? How this notion could be articulated in such a way so as to create a common ground?
My thoughts are very preliminary. So I essentially want to emphasize that I think this needs a lot more exploration, and that it could be, I think it could be very fruitful and robust. So I haven't done this exploration, nor do I think that anyone has really done this. But it seems like, to me, as you confront so many questions about human existence, obviously in religion, obviously in science, and I can give you some quotes of some prominent scientists who come, at the end of the day, come up with the notion of mystery. But it seems to be a constituent element of human existence, mystery. And I think it needs much more exploration. In the academy, if you invoke mystery in most settings, you're basically committing, as I said in my talk, intellectual suicide. It's assumed that you can't answer something, so you pull out the mystery card and play the mystery card, and it's seen as a science stopper or an exploration stopper. And I don't think that is necessarily the case. I think the more articulate scientists who are thinking about what they're doing in a larger sense, and just thoughtful human beings realize that there is a large amount of stuff that we don't know. And as we explore more, we realize, you know the phrase, that we find out that there's more and more we don't know. I don't think that unknowing aspect is constraining. I think it's a prod, it's a catalyst for learning and knowing more. I think we are impoverished if we don't have that sense of mystery. Impoverished as human beings, and I think impoverished in terms of some of these academic disciplines that we're talking about. But in the details, the conceptual details, I can go further if you'd like. I would be so bold as to suggest, I can't back this up, that mystery might actually be essential or very important in these larger conversations, meaning it might even have explanatory power. And that's dangerous. To say mystery has explanatory power, it's almost like you're demystifying mystery. Or if you advocate mystery, you better do it mysteriously, otherwise you've diluted what mystery is. But I think it may actually have explanatory power in the sense that we may see things more clearly if we have a proper sense of mystery, or take it the other way around. If we dismiss mystery, we may be missing something important about our explorations, whatever field they may be. Now, that's not detailed. In rigorous conceptual terms, I think that work needs to be further investigated. I think there's potential there.
So, I suppose that you also believe that the Orthodox tradition, which prioritizes mystical experience, divine revelation, and divine grace, setting in this way clear and definite limits to human rationality and knowledge, for all that could also foster some cognitive and epistemological qualities which are necessary for scientific research. I mean that the fact that the Orthodox tradition has this strong mystical aspect does not imply that it is a hostile
absolutely not.
force.
No, and I have beside me a string of quotes that I could, from very prominent scientists, starting from Isaac Newton and Stephen Weinberg, Freeman Dyson, and others, that suggest just the opposite. Now, they're not talking about the Orthodox tradition, but I think if you invoke mystery, Orthodoxy has a lot to say about mystery, maybe more so than any of the Christian traditions. And it's important, but all of these thinkers say at the end of the day, we're going to be, no matter what you explore, that exploration will reveal further mysteries. And I think Orthodoxy has a lot to contribute there.
Today, in your comment on Professor Xi's paper in this conference, you used the notion of, you evoked the notion of mystery, in pointing out that the traffic flow in the bridge between science and religion, more often than not, is one-directional, moving from religion to science. In what ways could also contemporary science benefit from religion?
What aspect of science are you talking about? Just science as science inquiry, or science?
Or what aspects of scientific practice or conceptual edifice? You already mentioned ethics, for example.
Sure. Again, I'm not a scientist, I'm a historian. But in talking to scientists, I suppose at the basic motivational level of why a person becomes a scientist, it is to understand something about the natural order. And I would think that mystery might be, in the sense that it could be linked to curiosity, a exploration of the unknown and what's there to explore, could be beneficial at that level. It's certainly at the level of looking back at the whole enterprise of science. What is it doing? What are we doing here and all this stuff? And you can look to technology that's obviously products of scientific inquiry. You can, and that relationship is a two-way street, science and technology. But what is it all for? What's unfolding? And in that sense of our exploration, I think mystery becomes utterly crucial. Where is science taking us? What's the end game of it? And mystery would suggest we don't know. But I think it gives added meaning to what we're doing. Otherwise, we're involved in but we're involved in our separate little explorations. But what's the larger end? What are we doing in the aggregate as human beings throughout our history, and now as we're exploring the macro and the micro worlds the way that we do with such sophistication? What's the point of it all? What is going on here? Here's where I think, obviously, religion plays a huge role, and again, I'm repeating myself, but I think mystery is a large component. In my own private life, if I may be personal, and you probably want to edit this out, but in my own private life, more and more I confront mysteries, and more I am comfortable embracing them. Maybe as a younger person you want to get it all straight. I must know this. This is what, I've got to have a logical explanation for everything. And at some point you realize your own limitations. And that is liberating. It's not constraining. It's saying, okay, I don't have to know. And in fact, I'm along for a great mysterious ride. Thank you, God. This is wonderful. So at the larger sense of meaning, I think that's where it really plays a huge role at multiple levels.
So, do you think that the interaction between religion and the sciences, more particularly, could cast light to even human experience that are considered more dark from the unconscious level of human experience, or to other aspects of human experience that pertain to what you called as mystery or mysterious? Do you think that the interaction between religion and science would work better on that direction, or the application of religion in science?
I'm not sure I can speak eloquently. I know I can't speak eloquently, but I'm not sure I can speak meaningfully to that. But I suspect, yes, I suspect that it could very much contribute. You use the term darker, so I'm not sure exactly what you mean. But in collecting books and materials on mystery, there's a whole genre of literature, academic and quasi-academic, on paranormal activity and that sort of kind of fringe kinds of things that you might look at with some suspicion. But I do think at one level it points to we really don't know a lot about things. I mean, think about our understanding of the world. This is where being a historian may help. Think about our understanding of the world 300 years ago, and think of what's known at that time. And now the world is much more mysterious, isn't it? In terms of we've comprehended a lot, we've understood a lot, But we now realize that at the micro and macro level, things are quite mysterious. That is interesting. We don't know much about human consciousness. That's a big mystery. And who knows, some of the things that we look at in your own work in alchemy, things that once were mainstream now are further understanding reveals they may not be terribly fortuitous avenues to explore. But there are other things that we may have thrown away as sort of not being that crucial or central that may actually turn out to be very important.
And if we, conversely, could science cast light to aspects of religious faith and experience, mystical visions or miracles? Do you believe that science as such could cast light to that?
Science as such? Well, science has to deal with what is measurable. It has to, well, no, there's conceptual science too, but I'll use the general terms. If I could substitute science for empirical, I'd be very comfortable. I think science can help us. I do believe in miracles, but what's my basis for that? I can't explain scientifically, although I had a conversation last night with an eminent scientist who was actually giving him a reasoned, sophisticated, scientifically reason for the plausibility of miracles, or at least the not impossibility. That's pretty double negative, but the not impossibility of miracles. But I have no problem with them. Why? Because I've experienced one or two that you could write off as pure coincidence, but with the eyes of faith, they appear to be quite clearly miraculous, or so largely incomprehensible otherwise, you have to sort of look at it that way. But I'm not alone. That would be just my own experience. Who cares? You're making a big deal about your own interpretations of things in your own life. But then you go back in history and you look at some things that have happened that science at its worst, I think, that's too harsh. But we have, using science, eliminated them from our understanding. Oh, that's what they thought back then. They had miracles. And we realize that in the Latin tradition, the Roman Catholic tradition, there's a whole process for sainthood that relies on empirical evidence of miracles. I don't know the actual process, but I've spoken to a very eminent scientist who got interested in this and said the documentation of some of these things is amazing. So what do you do with that? I am enamored with the work of two historians right now, Robert Orsi and in America at Northwestern, formerly Harvard Divinity School, and Carlos Eyre at Yale. And they approach the supernatural without the necessity of bracketing it ontologically. They basically don't feel the necessity to explain it away. Historians will say, well, they believed at that time that there was a miracle. These are gentlemen who are saying, I don't have to put that caveat in there, which tends to imply, without saying, but we know better now. And they're suggesting that when you do that, you understand the past better by not sort of or putting artificial blinders on our understanding of the past. So I guess what I'm saying is my basis for this is human experience, which is empirical. Can't explain it all scientifically, but it's empirical. And evidential, in my sense, reinforced by my own experience. So it's empirical and experiential.
Let's get a little bit away from the mystery, even though I really like this topic. Could present-day Christian thought provide fertile sources of rational criticism on contemporary scientific practice?
I'm going to revert to my standard answer here, is that I don't think religion does much, again, for the scientists in the laboratory. I think religion criticizes, in the sense that I think you mean, the larger endeavor of what science is. What are societies, what are funding agencies, governmental agencies attempting to do with scientific research? Is this, and that gets into all kinds of things, of funding priorities. What are we attempting to do? One, oh, I shouldn't go there. Yeah, I better play it safe. But I think that's where religion, and so I'm really getting religion / social ethics primarily.
Does the relationship between science and religion vary significantly according to the national context?
Well, that's a very interesting question. If this were more of a dialogue, I'd ask you what you think, because being in this conference, it was sort of a yes and no. There does seem to be national flavors to this conversation in the Eastern tradition. When you have various branches of Orthodoxy that have a high degree of similarity, but also some national or regional differences. But I tend to think that there are differences. Based upon my experience in the Western branch, there aren't that, I mean, Protestants and Catholics have different confessional approaches, but when they come to science and religion, they seem to be on the same level in terms of, it's not a parochial thing, we all understand that there's different contributions. When it comes to Orthodoxy, I sensed, and I really can't be precise, but I sensed a different kind of discussion in the last couple of days here than I usually get in my other settings. What's the nature of the difference? Maybe I'm saying the same thing, but there's a sense of a deeper tradition and a need to be consonant with that Orthodox tradition / theology than the Western discussion has been, which tends to be looking at it, again I'm using general terms, tends to look at it historically. This seems to be a much more living tradition that is important to maintain, especially by the clergy in the church. And that seems, it seems to have there's a different texture to the conversation. When I've been in conferences or settings, occasionally a Roman Catholic priest will come in with a clerical collar, but we've seen so many Orthodox priests and higher ups in the organization here, and that level of church involvement is rare in the Western conversation. How that will color it specifically, I don't know. I think it has potential to be very fruitful, but I suppose it could limit it as well.
Modern science is considered, correctly or mistakenly, to be a creation of the West. Do you believe that this image affects its relation with Orthodoxy?
Another interesting question. Yes, it does tend to be associated. I know that there are some historians, and one or two of them that were present here, that would challenge that notion. But there, you'd have to, it's another complex story. There were lots of things that fed into the rise of science that weren't Western. But I think it's indisputable that the notion that we have of contemporary science has strong roots in the West. Whether that can color it, I don't know. There might be a sense that and I don't mean this to be offensive, I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but that the East might see that as the need to catch up in some regards. But then that's dismissive of any Eastern contributions to this, to science. And there may be many more that I'm not aware of or that haven't been explored fully. But I do think, again, not to be offensive, but there may be that notion of Orthodoxy sort of needing to get up to speed with this conversation. It seems to be in the early stages of science and religion dialogue. But so that suggests that the Western experience is paradigmatic, that it is normative, this is the way you must go, and I don't like that either. But so there does seem to be a difference in terms of the science and religion dialogue as it's unfolded in the West is a bit more mature than what I heard here. There's a lot of questions that have been thrashed out for decades now, and sort of have answers in quotation marks. Orthodoxy seems to be a more of a blank tablet. How it unfolds it's very interesting and be very exciting to see what specific directions this conversation takes here in the East.
On the basis of your personal knowledge and expertise, are there any distinct features of Orthodox Christianity that set it apart from other Christian denominations when considering its interaction with science?
I don't know enough to give you a considered answer there. My initial ones, which you've already heard probably too many times, is its sense of mystery. Which I'm fixated on that, but I think it's potentially enormously important. Not sure I could say anything much more than that.
What are, from your point of view, the limits of the dialogue between science and Christianity?
I missed the word. The what?
The limits of this dialogue between science and Christianity, a more general question.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Part of the fact is that they're both common human enterprises, but they are asking essentially different questions or addressing different questions. At the end of the day, they got to come together in terms of individuals who are believers and are scientists who are interested in science. As individuals, have to integrate these notions, or they become segmented parts of almost a schizophrenic outlook. But they use separate methodologies. I think the notion came up in our conference here about theology being a scientific field or something like that. And it depends on what you mean by science. In the German sense of Wissenschaft, that it's an organized form of knowledge, of course, but it has a different method. And so I'm not sure the two can be brought together as neatly as the term science and religion suggests.
A last one, or maybe you have something more to add. What are the factors that presently hinder or make difficult the discussion on Orthodox or on Orthodoxy in science?
What are the factors that make that?
Let me make it again.
What
are the factors that presently hinder or make difficult the discussion?
Speaking as a person who's not a major player in the field, but a pretty observant person, it seemed to me that, again, assuming that the presentations that I've heard over the last 48 hours are typical, that there might be some benefit if some of the literature by the best people in science and religion in the West, people in the East were, I'm using shorthand, people in the East were more conversant with that literature. It could be that you're trying to reinvent a wheel that has already been, there's much been work, and I didn't sense that, for instance, Ronald Numbers is one of the premier historians of science. He's held many offices, written many books. John Brooke and Peter Harrison both held chairs in science religion at Oxford. Both have given Gifford lectures. Both have written extensively on the relationship of science and religion. In listening, again, as a fringe player to the conversations, it struck me that they have not, most people in the Eastern discussion so far, and I'm sure there are exceptions, but aren't conversant with what they've said, what they've looked at, the questions. I think that might be a limiting factor. It might be, again, I don't mean to be insulting. I don't think the West is the tutor of the East, and that brings up old tensions. But it might be fruitful for those in the East that are pursuing this dialogue or discussion further to have really in-depth exposure to what the West has done in order to develop their own approach to some of these things. I think there could be much benefit. So that if that's a hindrance, I guess that's one that comes to mind. Have I insulted you? I'm sorry. I don't mean to.
Do you have anything to add? Something that we didn't ask? Something that you would like to mention, anyways?
No, I guess it's sort of I'm enormously grateful for the various branches of the Templeton Foundation for their patronage, personally, and then events like this that we've been participating in, and countless other events over the last several decades have fostered a conversation. There were some grandiose notions of actually spawning a whole disciplinary field. I think that was overblown. But they've sponsored a number of conversations that are fruitful, ongoing, interesting, personally and professionally. They've enabled a collection of people, again, I'm using shorthand, in the West, who have gotten together. And so one of my best friends, literally best friends, is William Shea, who I met in Oxford at a Templeton-sponsored event. He now is a close friend on multiple levels. And others. There's a community of scholars that has been formed that can only benefit from further inclusion from people in the East and that perspective. And I think the Templeton Foundations, there are 3 of them, sometimes get criticized for, throwing all sorts of money out. But they've been very, and I've managed a few Templeton grants, they've been very generous and non-controlling. Once you have an investigation that they're interested in, they don't try to manipulate the outcome. You're free to explore whatever. There's no company line that you must comport to. And that's been wonderful. So I don't know, it's probably nothing you want to put online, but that's enormous. And they need to be congratulated for Sir John Templeton's foresight to do this sort of thing. It's enabled a lot of interesting relationships and conversations.